Hey everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's Explainer. So if you're gearing up for the MP Set English Literature exam, let's be real, you might be feeling a very familiar sense of panic right about now. You're probably staring at that massive syllabus, feeling totally overwhelmed, and wondering how on earth anyone is supposed to cover all of this before exam day. Well, let's just take a deep breath together, because today we're going to explore how breaking down the main topics and really analyzing previous year questions, or PYQs, might just be the secret to building a highly confident exam strategy. We're going to see exactly what the data tells us to do.
You know, there's a quote that just perfectly captures that struggle. As author Prem Shankar Pandey so accurately puts it, the syllabus seems like an ocean, an old banyan tree which has many branches with deep roots inside. It's beautifully poetic, sure, but man, is it also terrifying. I completely empathize with that feeling. Trying to conquer this thing by just reading endless, boring, and incredibly expensive textbooks from cover to cover, that's enough to make anyone want to pull their hair out. But as we dig into the actual material, a really reassuring truth starts to emerge. You don't actually have to drink every single drop of that ocean to pass.
Okay, let's dive into this. When we look at the absolute best ways to tackle this beast, a fascinating shift in mindset emerges. Instead of relying on what we typically call hard work, that panic-inducing, aimless reading through absolute mountains of text, we can pivot to something much, much more effective. We can pivot to smart work. This is essentially our golden ticket. Smart work means analyzing the previous year questions to understand exactly how the examiner thinks. It's all about looking for patterns. It's about highly efficient, targeted learning rather than just blind memorization. So let's explore exactly what that looks like in practice.
To really understand this, we need to look at the real battlefield. When we review the actual instruction sheet for the MP Set Paper 2 in English, which is exactly what will be sitting on your desk when the clock starts, we need to focus on the numbers. There are 100 questions in this paper, they carry 200 marks, and crucially, there is no negative marking. Let that sink in for a second. No negative marking literally changes everything. It means your goal isn't to be some flawless walking encyclopedia. Your goal is simply to correctly answer as many of these 100 specific questions as possible using educated guesses and our smart work strategy. You have the total freedom to take calculated risks.
So let's visually shrink that oceanic syllabus right down to size. We can actually categorize the vast majority of the exam into 3 highly manageable, highly testable buckets: British literature, Indian English literature, and literary theory alongside some miscellaneous topics. Just by organizing your study plan into these 3 core pillars, you immediately regain control. It goes from an infinite tree of roots to just 3 clear boxes. So let's open up that first bucket, British literature, and see what smart work looks like when we look at the actual questions.
When you look at actual PYQs on British drama, notice what they are really asking. One question asks about Ben Jonson's Every Man in His Humor and the medieval physiology it's based on. Then, another asks you to identify the source of the famous "Life is but a walking shadow" quote, which of course is Shakespeare's Macbeth. This tells us something absolutely crucial. It tells us that broad, foundational knowledge is way more rewarded than obscure trivia. The examiners want you to know the defining characteristics of major works and the most iconic lines of central figures. You don't need to read every obscure play in existence, you just need to know the titans inside and out.
And speaking of defining characteristics, consider the definition of a miracle play pulled straight from the exam options. It's defined as a dramatization of an event or legend from the life of a saint or a martyr. The big takeaway here is that memorizing these specific literary terms and their standard textbook definitions pays off instantly. When you see terms like miracle play, morality play, or interlude on your exam paper, you should have a crisp, one-sentence definition ready to fire off in your brain. Flashcards are going to be your absolute best friend here.
Now let's move over to the poetry section and see how this pattern builds. Again, looking at real PYQs, they're heavily testing your knowledge of broad categories like occasional poetry and the graveyard poets. But there's a specific question about T.S. Eliot that actually reveals a massive secret about how to strategically study for this exam. It completely shifts how you should be looking at long, complex poems.
Let's break down the logic of that specific Eliot question together. The exam asks, what is not part of 4 quartets? The options they gave were East Coker, Burnt Norton, and the Dry Salvages. Now think about this. If you had just done the smart work of memorizing the 4 structural titles of that masterpiece, you wouldn't even need to have read the poems themselves. You would instantly spot Ash Wednesday as the odd one out. Knowing simple structural lists of major works, like chapters, sections, or subtitles, is literally the ultimate shortcut to the right answer. It'll save you weeks of dense reading.
Moving right along into our second bucket, Indian literature and culture. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the examiners focus their questions here. For example, there's a question asking who defined the term Indo-Anglian as suggesting a relation between two countries rather than a country and a language. This shows us that the examiners are highly focused on the specific terminology surrounding Indian literature and English, and more importantly, they care deeply about the pioneering critics who actually defined it.
When looking into Indian authors, a crystal clear pattern emerges. You have to focus on the milestones. Take Jayanta Mahapatra, for example. What do you absolutely need to know about him for the exam? Well, you'd need to know he was the very first Indian to win the Sahitya Academy Award for English poetry. And you need to associate him with his classic poems, Indian Summer and Hunger. Memorizing specific achievements, firsts, and the landmark works of key Indian authors is a practically guaranteed way to secure marks in this section without getting lost in the weeds.
All right, let's simulate the pressure of the exam for a quick second. I'm going to hit you with a rapid-fire question to test your reflexes on our third bucket. Literary theory. Ready? Who developed the notion of interpretive communities? Think about it.
The answer? It's Stanley Fish. You see, it turns out that passing the literary theory section doesn't mean you need a PhD-level understanding of dense, complex philosophical treatises. Not at all. It is almost entirely about successfully matching major critics to their core concepts. Stanley Fish equals interpretive communities. Raymond Williams equals culture and society. It's essentially a high-level matching game, and you can absolutely win it by just keeping your association straight with some simple, targeted memorization.
Let's keep that momentum going. We'll test your knowledge of literary movements with another quick question. Samuel Beckett's iconic play Waiting for Godot belongs to which overarching dramatic tradition? Have a guess. If you said, the theater of the absurd, boom, you just earn yourself 2 marks. When you look at how questions are structured, like asking about kitchen sink drama or the theater of the absurd, it proves that the exam highly categorizes texts. Plays, novels, and poems are almost always grouped into overarching traditions. You really need to know these broad categories and who belongs in them rather than just getting bogged down in individual text summaries. If you know the era and the genre, you can usually deduce the right answer.
So how do we systematically tackle the rest of the syllabus? We do it by relying on high-yield exam lists. As heavily recommended by top prep materials, you need to curate and memorize specific lists. Booker Prize winners, Nobel laureates in literature, Sahitya Academy Award winners, and lists categorizing genres like partition novels or dystopian novels. Why? Because these lists represent the universally agreed-upon peaks of literature. Examiners use them constantly to build their multiple-choice options. Memorizing these is the absolute peak of smart work strategy for the miscellaneous section. If you see a prize winner in an option, there's a huge probability it's the answer, or at least your key to eliminating a wrong choice.
We started this explainer by acknowledging that the MP set syllabus looks like an intimidating, totally endless ocean. But as we've seen by exploring the actual data and really analyzing the PYQs, you absolutely do not have to drown. You now have the map. You know to look for structural lists, you know to match critics to concepts, and you know to memorize those key award winners. So the only question left to ask yourself today is this. Armed with this targeted strategy, which topic are you going to conquer first? Get out there, start your smart work, and best of luck with your prep. You've totally got this.